Started. All right. Well, welcome and thank you for joining us to today's webinar entitled Food in the Time of COVID-19. My name is Jack Galt. I'm with the UK Alumni Association. Today's session is part of the Great Teachers on Great Challenges virtual speaker series that's co-sponsored by the Alumni Association as well as the Provost Center for the Enhancement of Learning and Teaching, CELT. The series will regularly conduct conversations with UK faculty who have won UK Alumni Association's Great Teacher Award, the oldest continuously given award for teachers at UK. With the goal of responding to the numerous questions pertaining to COVID-19 and its effects both locally and globally, these sessions will unpack the insights and expertise of UK's teacher scholars to all audiences. First, let me introduce our two co-hosts for today's webinar. First, Marcy Hicks, our Director of Philanthropy for the UK Alumni Association, and also Trey Knatzer, Associate Director for the UK Center for the Enhancement of Learning and Teaching. Marcy and Trey will be assisting me with today's webinar. And now I'd like to introduce the moderator of today's program, Steve Isaacs. Steve is a 1999 recipient of the UK Great Teacher Award, an extension professor in farm management and leadership development in the College of Agriculture, Food, and Environment, and is also the co-director of the Kentucky Agricultural Leadership Program. Steve?
Thanks, Jack, and really appreciate the efforts of CELT and the UK Alumni Association to sponsor this series. We're excited to do this. I think we have some really good panelists today and certainly a very good and timely topic. Yeah, I think most of us can probably remember back to an introductory psych course somewhere and Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Today we're talking about food and COVID-19, and food is at the base level of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. It's the kind of thing that if that need is met, we tend not to think too much about it, but if it's not met, we probably don't think about anything else. So I wanted to introduce things a bit with a couple of quotes and some things that I've been giving some thought about, and then we have asked some of our colleagues in the College of Ag, Food, and the Environment to bring their insights to this. This whole notion of a food supply chain is a long and complex chain from farmers and processors and distributors all the way to consumers and end users, and I think we're representing that that chain and that spectrum pretty well today. My first quote, and this, well, I'll date myself here. I was in high school in the late 60s and early 70s. Walter Cronkite was on the CBS Evening News every day, and he had a colleague and commentator named Eric Severide that often at the end of the program offered a commentary. Now, I'm not sure of the date. I remember hearing this. It was somewhere in the late 60s or early 70s, and Eric Severide said something that I have remembered for 50 years. He said, sort of in the vernacular of the time, "Few men are more than 9 meals away from crime or suicide." That statement highlights, I think, the fragility and precarious nature of a food chain. 9 meals is 3 days. That's not a very long time. So that may be one of the reasons that I wound up in agriculture. I think food is important, and we all think it's important every day when we need it. About a year ago, I had a recommendation for a book to read, and read that. It's a British historian named Lizzie Collingham. She has a book called The Taste of War, and it is essentially about the role that food played in both the initiation and the conduct and even the resolution of World War II. And in that catastrophic event of the 20th century, 50 to 60 million people died. Collingham would contend that half of them died of food-related causes. Famine and starvation were the source of about half of the casualties in World War II. In fact, and I wasn't aware of this, more than half of the Japanese soldiers died of starvation rather than combat wounds. The war was started because Japan and Germany primarily needed more food for a growing population. So the food was the initiation of the war, the conduct of the war. The well-fed armies performed better. Very interesting read about Lizzie Collingham called The Taste of War. And I think those of us who work in ag and ag policy are aware that much of the ag policy of the last half of the 20th and early 21st century has been based around food. Those food insecurity issues that were really critical in Europe following World War II were the basis for much of their ag policy. You know, most of us, 21st century Americans, have enjoyed an abundant and relatively inexpensive food supply. But COVID-19 has tended to put food back in the headlines. So we've seen images of long lines of cars at food distribution centers. We've seen images of farmers dumping milk and plowing under tomatoes. I have a suspicion that those may be some of the lasting images of this pandemic as we go forward. So this whole food chain, and I mentioned that we've brought together Will Snell, Tammy Stephenson, and Jason Swanson, who are experts in their areas, all the way from the farm level to the consumer and restaurant level. And they are going to have, I think, some really good insights for us this afternoon. This food chain, this food supply chain, is subject to weather and market forces and consumer preferences and perceptions, and now certainly is being affected by the global pandemic of COVID-19. We're going to kick this off and introduce this with going back to the farmer level. Will Snell is a colleague of mine in agricultural economics. Will and I have worked together for about 3 decades now. Will, I think we were probably working together when we were both graduate students at different universities. Will is, I think Jack mentioned, Will and I are co-directors of the Kentucky Ag Leadership Program. We're on the same floor, a few doors apart, and until mid-March of this year, we saw each other pretty regularly. Now we're seeing each other pretty regularly, but just on a Zoom meeting. Will teaches a course in the College of Ag of food and agricultural marketing principles. He's going to bring some insights from that class. But by way of introduction, my colleague Will Snell is just one of the top ag policy experts in the country. I've traveled with him many times to Frankfurt and to the halls of Congress in DC, where Will is on a first name basis with many of the policymakers at the state and the national level. So we're going to open our discussion today with some insights from the farm level and how that's translating down the food supply chain. So Will, you're up.
All right, Steve, thank you so much. I'm really honored to be a part of this series. And Jack, I'm one of those proud alums of the University of Kentucky. Both my parents graduated from UK. Both my daughters have degrees from this university. I met my wife here, and as Steve pointed out, I've been part of the UK Big Blue Nation family for a long time, over 40 years. And therefore, I'm really looking forward to this discussion. I think Steve did a great job of kind of putting it in perspective, and certainly looking forward to working with Tammy and Jason and getting interaction with our audience today. As Steve mentioned, besides working in extension, I also teach a course called Food and Ag Marketing. Now, back in my younger days as a teacher in this college, the class was primarily farm students. We talked a lot about agricultural marketing. But today's students are very different. They want to talk about food. It's not that they are not interested in what happens at the farm level. They just removed several generations from the farm. And therefore, they're interested in what happens on the food side. So what I typically do the first day of class is I ask all my students, I said, I want you to raise your hand if you are you consider yourself an agricultural producer. Now, granted, over the years, a number of those students raising their hands have declined, given the diversity of our student population. Then I asked the question, how many of you all consider yourself an agricultural consumer? Well, except for the ones that are on the cell phone or maybe already asleep in the class, you know, everybody raises their hand. And everybody on this webinar, again, is an agricultural consumer, whether it be food, fiber, or fuel. We're all impacted. And I go on and make the point that, you know, you may buy an automobile every 2 or 3 years, or a cell phone, you know, every couple of years, or a home 3 or 4 times in your lifetime. But the food market and what goes on at the ag level, all the way through the supply chain, is something that you participate in, and it impacted, you know, several times a day. So again, it impacts us all multiple times a day, and what goes on at the farm level does have an impact. What I've got I guess the second thing I do in the class the first day is talk about, I have a photo of downtown Chicago. And I'll say, students, I want you to put yourself as one of those individuals walking to a restaurant at noon. And when you get in that restaurant, you may be looking at a pizza or a sandwich or a salad. And you know, you look at the menu and you make your decision. If the waiter would come back and say, oh, we don't have that. It's like, well, you'd be shocked. Just like if you went to the concession at a ball game or go to, you know, your grocery store. Outside of, you know, a winter storm event where we've seen that happen, we're so used to it. My students are, and they're just, you know, just take it for granted, as Steve pointed out. So what I want to do in the next few minutes, I've got 5 slides I want to share with you, talking about how COVID has impacted different participants along the supply chain. And then we'll switch it over to Tammy to talk specifically about our consumers out there, and Jason to talk about the restaurants. So let me share my screen. And, you know, I'll just start off by saying most of the attention at this point has really been on the consumer side. Steve pointed out some pictures that you've certainly seen on the news, the panic buying, the empty shelves. But also, many of you all probably have noticed an increase in food prices. Now, this slide is looking at US food price inflation over the past 20 years. And you can see some volatility, but over the past 20 years, food prices have increased on an annual level about 2.3% every year. In fact, in recent years, we've had very little food price inflation. But after COVID hit in March, and then really some of the supply chain disruptions came about, the headlines in the newspaper indicated that food prices in the month of April, just 1 month, increased by 1.5%, which was the highest level in more than 30 years. But also, USDA is putting forward a forecast they did a couple of weeks ago, saying, you know, with the supply chain coming back online, that we're probably looking at food price increases of about 2 to 3% this year. Again, you can see that that's not totally much different than what we've experienced over the past 20 years. So again, this has impacted us all in terms of availability, how we get our food, what we eat. But as far as the overall impact on consumers, I would argue it's certainly not been anywhere near as abrupt as what our farmers have seen during this time period. Actually, the farm economy was in a very fragile situation coming into COVID. We'd gone through 4 or 5 years with building world supplies. We had some extreme weather events affecting some producers. And as many of you all realize, we were right in the middle of a trade war. And all these factors resulted in farm income being down about 25 to 50% during that time period. But beginning this year, there was some optimism out there in farm country. We just had signed a deal with China, a big trade deal with ag at the center. We were in the midst of ratifying a trade agreement with Mexico and Canada, discussions with the European Union, also with the United Kingdom. So some optimism, and ag was hoping we'd get a demand shock that would start pulling the farm economy out of the doldrums and start seeing some increases in prices. Well, we ended up with a demand shock, but it wasn't trade, it wasn't positive. It was a demand shock brought about by COVID-19. You know, typically when we have these demand shocks and, you know, the economy goes south, we don't necessarily see a big impact necessarily on the food market or at the farm level. Because while we have a downturn in the economy, we might not go on that vacation or we might not buy that car, but we all have to eat. Yes, we may trade that filet for a hamburger. We may buy a private label instead of a national brand. We may not go out to eat as much, but typically agriculture and the food markets tend to be a little bit shielded from downturns in the farm economy or the overall economy. This slide here is looking at the last major economic downturn we had. It was the Great Recession, many of you all recall, in 2008 and 2009. We saw at that point, yes, a little bit of blip in how much we spent for food. We had a little bit of an increase in food prices. Farm prices came down a little bit, but you can see it wasn't dramatic compared to a lot of other industries out there, such as the banking industry or housing industry. And again, we were somewhat, shielded from this downturn. But COVID-19 has been much different for the farm and food economy out there. For one thing, the demand shock has been much, much bigger. We had our economist on last week, Jack, that talked about all the jobs that were lost, all the income. We didn't have individuals that, no longer could afford a nice steak, or, income sensitive food like seafood were really impacted. We had that shutdown of our restaurants, our schools, our travel, entertainment, which again affected, demand for certain food items out there. And then many of us worked at home. We weren't driving. And if you know much about the ethanol market, a third of the corn that we produce here in the United States comes or is being used for ethanol and gasoline production. So, again, a big demand shock hit the ag and food sector. But also, as Steve alluded to, we had the supply chain disruption. We had these schools closed. We had restaurants that were temporarily closed. All this produce that was going to the restaurant business was no longer needed at that time. And we had farmers that were delaying selling. Steve mentioned the delaying of destroying of crops, the dumping of milk, the euthanizing of livestock out there. And one thing I always point out at this juncture is that agriculture is very different from other sectors. When other sectors need a pullback in supply, they can typically reduce the supply out there. They can shut down the production line, shut down the factory line. But in ag, we cannot tell that lettuce not to grow, or we can't, tell that cow not to produce that milk, or, a hog that's ready to be slaughtered, just all of a sudden to go on a diet. So we cannot typically pull back on supply very quickly. So you combine the big demand shock we got this time with all the supply disruption and the backup of farm level supply. And while I told you food prices went up 2 or 3% maybe during this time frame, we saw most of our agricultural commodities, due to this demand and supply disruption in the marketplace, fall 20, 30, 40% or more. So again, it's been a very, very difficult time at the farm level. My last slide, just, going forward, a lot of concerns out there amongst the folks that I work with in ag circles, certainly the financial picture. Yes, there are some government dollars available to help farm income, but a report came out yesterday that even with that government support, that farm income is going to be down about 15% in 2020. Keep on, remind you again, we are already in a very fragile environment to begin with. And, the expectation is that 2021 could be even worse for the ag economy. And it's not only the financial health, but Steve does a lot of work with the mental health out there. We're very concerned about our farm population given this continued prolonged downturn in the farm economy. A lot of farmers out there have been able to kind of weather the storm, so to speak, just due to the fact that their bankers have stayed with them, due to the fact that balance sheets have remained pretty solid during this time period because land prices were fairly strong. But a lot of economists are worried what's going to happen to the price of land. We're a very labor dependent sector out there, and with not only in the field, but also our processing facility being very dependent upon labor. What's going to happen if we have some event that affects a big labor supply in terms of being able to move food and agriculture forward in the supply chain. And the final thing there, trade. Lots of news media about trade, a lot of trade tensions. We're very dependent upon trade in ag, and what happens if we have a major trade disruption as a result of COVID. But I'll finish up with opportunities. We got a very captive audience out there right now. All of us are concerned about what's happening with our food supply chain, not only us, but food banks, policymakers, the media, we're all talking about ag and food. So we're hopefully going to have a good conversation on ways to improve the supply chain. We've got a lot of opportunities, we feel like, with producers at the local market, not only directly selling products to consumers, but also some of our regional processing opportunities for some of our small businesses as well as farmers directly. We also feel like we can work with those national retailers that, again, more consumers demanding local food, and therefore an opportunity to work with some of the national grocery chains. And then finally, just an appreciation for our food supply chain out there. Again, we're being talked about, as an industry all across the board. So let me just finish with just a comment. Steve, you and I have had the opportunity to travel the globe, and we've seen food supply chains all over the world. But as you pointed out, we're very fortunate to live in this country to have a very efficient food supply chain, safe, providing adequate supplies to most of our consumers. I had a call this past week from a reporter says, what are you folks in ag going to do about this broken food supply chain? And my first comment is, well, I don't consider it broken. It's just disrupted, and we've got to adjust. Our farmers have got to adjust. Tammy will talk about how our consumers are adjusting, and Jason will do the same thing from a restaurant business side point as well. So, Steve, I'll kick it back to you, and we'll continue our discussion along the food supply chain.
Okay, well, thanks a lot, and really appreciate your insights. And I think most of you are aware that on almost any point Will made, we could dig down and spend a lot more time on that. But we really want to move along, and I'm going to introduce Tammy Stephenson, who is the promotional material on this said associate professor, but congratulations, Tammy. She just got word she has been promoted to full professor in dietetics and human nutrition. Tammy teaches a wide range of courses from introductory to advanced nutrition. She was, I think, as Jack mentioned, the 2016 Great Teacher Award winner. And Tammy, the USDA would say there's about 2 million farmers in the U.S., and about 200,000 of them produce 80 to 90% of the product, but there are 330 million consumers here. So everybody has an interest in your side of this, the consumer nutrition side. So Tammy is just a wonderful teacher and a wonderful colleague, and we're going to let her talk about sort of the consumer level. Tammy?
Great. Thank you so much. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here and get started. So the first picture that you're going to see is from the 2016 Great Teacher Award ceremony. So absolutely thank you to the Alumni Association for sponsoring those awards for so many years, and certainly an honor to be part of that group. And also thank you to SELT for putting this on, because as you all have been saying, we all eat food. So this is an important topic to every single person, because every single day we have to eat food to sustain life. So as we've been talking about, we're moving through the food system here, and Will did such a nice job of talking about the producer standpoint when it comes to the food system. And now I'll move on and talk about the consumer, and I'm going to tag team this with Jason, who will really focus on the hospitality industry. So again, we all have to eat food. Food is what fuels our body. And if we want to feel our best, then we need to put the best quality food into our body to accomplish that. And I would also argue, related to that, food is a basic human right. So as I go through my presentation, and we can certainly discuss more of this once we get through each of our presentation, I just want to touch on 3 main points. And so really first talking about what have been the changes to food access and our food purchase, food preparation, and food consumption habits, because certainly they changed because of COVID-19. And then moving on and talking about rates of food insecurity. The excellent presentation last week really got at the economic impact of COVID-19. And as Will talked about, the unemployment rates and things of that nature are going to impact the number of people experiencing food insecurity and having access to that healthy quality food on a regular basis. And then lastly, touching just a little bit on some of the relationships between nutrition and diet in general and the COVID-19, and thinking about what can we do to optimize our health so that if we were to be in contact with the COVID-19, to try to minimize the impact of that. So like I said, let's first start thinking about how have our food purchases and such changed since the pandemic began here in the United States for many of us in early March. So as Steve mentioned, I teach introductory nutrition, and this is usually one of the first types of slides and conversations that we have because students are in a nutrition class and they can become very ultra focused on specific nutrients and you need to eat this and not that and such. And I always try to say that's all well and good and I want you to know that information, but we have to think about what are all of those different factors that influence our food choices. And so thinking about how mood comes into play. What do I feel like having for dinner tonight? Certainly advertising, marketing. What does my family want to eat for dinner? What did I grow up eating? And then, what is my current health status? Am I concerned about my sodium intake or not? And that's probably going to impact my different food choices. So there was already this plate with all of these different factors coming into play. And then COVID-19 and the pandemic hit. And that really magnified some of the challenges that come with food access and ensuring everybody has access to healthy, well-balanced food. So Trey, if you can go ahead and put up the poll for me now. So this is the audience engagement part of the presentation. So if you could entertain me, as I talk through my next couple of slides, I really want you all to think about how have your food purchases and preparation habits changed since before the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. And go ahead and you can check as few or as many of those different options. And I'm going to go through a couple of examples in my own house as we do that, and then we'll pull up those results there. So, one of the changes that we know has occurred is how often people are going to the supermarket, and are they going into the supermarket? And I'm one of those people before this COVID-19 pandemic, I love to grocery shop. I love to go, figure out what I want, pick out the banana that I think and such. And the pandemic has changed that. And we know, myself included, now we're seeing many more people using, curbside pickup for their groceries, delivery of their groceries. So it's changed how we're accessing our food and what we're accessing as well. And then you've probably heard, through social media and online that a lot more people are baking. And so from pre-COVID-19, I'd be like, that's awesome, because we talk about if people were to eat at home more, they would eat more fruits, vegetables, healthy sorts of foods. So we have to remember, though, there's a couple different types of baking. So, here's an example just from my own home. We have our whole wheat muffins here with rhubarb and strawberries and some fruit on the side. So I imagine many people absolutely are probably eating more fruits and vegetables and healthier sorts of things. But we also have this going on. Close that up for a second. We also have this going on at our house. We also have a lot of baking happening. And I don't know if anybody else is experiencing this as well. So I have 3 teenage daughters and one of them loves to bake. And she had more time on her hands because she wasn't going to school. And so she was literally at the beginning of this trying to make a cake every day just because that was, how she was enjoying her time. And clearly we should not be eating a cake every day. And we know from the research that's been done so far that a lot of people are doing this baking, either for enjoyment or we have a little bit of stress baking happening as well. And this is why, many times if you went to the supermarket, it was difficult to find flour. It's still, at least here in Central Kentucky, difficult to find yeast in the supermarket, eggs, etc. Trey, is it possible to pull up that poll result again? I think I messed it up there when I needed to move forward. If not, it's okay.
I don't know if it's possible without losing all the results.
Okay, well, let's not do that then. As I quickly looked at them, it looked like many of you were experiencing what a lot of people are experiencing in terms of changing your purchase habits, definitely using more of the curbside pickup and such. So our purchase habits have changed. So number 2 point of discussion is how have rates of food insecurity changed due to the COVID-19 pandemic? Again, a lot of this driven by the economy and by unemployment rates. So when it comes to food insecurity, I want to start at the global level, and then I'm going to take it all the way down to the students at the University of Kentucky. So the World Health Organization estimates that the rates of food insecurity are going to double by the end of 2020 what they were a year ago. So we anticipate 265 million people across the globe will be experiencing food insecurity. Then if we take it to the United States, the Feeding America Network estimates that about 54 million individuals, this is up from 37 currently or prior to the COVID-19 pandemic. And what's really important out of that is that this includes 1 in 4 children. And when you think about children, many of the children here in the United States in particular went to school through about mid-March. And then for many children haven't been back to school since then. Well, a lot of children who were food insecure prior to this pandemic were getting oftentimes free lunch, free breakfast, meals to take home on the weekend as well when they were going to school. So because we now don't have the children at school, that certainly created some challenges. Now, fortunately, government and community agencies have really stepped up to continue to provide these services, during the school year and now during the summer as well. But really important to consider that 1 in 4 children. Also, when you think about the number of people who have lost their jobs, who've been furloughed, a recent statistic indicated that 44% of Americans say they're afraid they'll be unable to afford food or groceries. Again, just the basic needs for survival. So when we look at food insecurity across the country, what this map is showing us are projected rates of food insecurity by the end of 2020. And here we have the darker the salmon color indicates higher rates of food insecurity in that particular state. So you can see here, those of us who are in Central or in Kentucky, we are at that higher rate of food insecurity, as are several other states in the southeastern and the southern United States. So definitely where you live impacts your risk of food insecurity. As well, there's certainly racial disparities when it comes to rates of food insecurity. And so what I'm showing here is the data from 2018. I haven't seen any projected for 2020 yet, but overall rates of food insecurity in 2018 were around 11%, but for African American households, double that, so about 21%. And then if you look at the Feeding America website, it actually tones in by county level, so you can see individual counties. And so just one example of this, if we look at Jefferson County, Mississippi, which has a majority of the population is African American, about 34% of that population is food insecure. And then if we look at over Loudoun County, Virginia, compare that to the 8.6%. So absolutely, there are differences based on race. Now, let's take a look a little closer at Kentucky. So Kentucky, before the COVID-19 pandemic, about 15% food insecure. We anticipate that that's going to jump up to around 20% by the end of this year. Now, our ranking is actually probably going to stay the same. So we were ranked number 8 in terms of highest rates of food insecurity, anticipate the same. I just want to draw your attention to Nevada here. So Nevada is was ranked number 20, but by the end of this year, anticipating that they're going to jump and be tied with Kentucky in terms of rates of food insecurity, not a good thing. And a lot of that has to do with Las Vegas, and changes to the hospitality industry within Las Vegas have led to high rates of unemployment, which are going to contribute to those higher rates of food insecurity. And then, you can dive down even deeper and look at those individual counties on this graph as well. The darker the color indicates the higher the rates of food insecurity. So southeastern Kentucky is particularly hit hard by the food insecurity. And as I mentioned, college students are not immune to food insecurity. We know not just at the University of Kentucky, but across the country, across the globe, college students are struggling to meet their basic needs before COVID-19, and certainly it's going to make it even more challenging after COVID-19. So when we think about college students, paying for tuition, room, board, professional clothing, their textbooks, and all those other things that come with, in many cases, being a young adult. So, we know that food insecurity and challenges with basic needs exist with these college students. And so fortunately, UK has been very proactive. There is a UK Basic Needs Center that continues to offer resources to our students through a virtual means. One of the programs that I'm specifically involved with is the Farm to Fork program. This is through the Campus Kitchen at the University of Kentucky. This program was started in 2018, and it provides, during the semesters, once a week, a healthy lunchtime meal for free to UK students. And the meals are locally sourced. They include a lot of fruits, vegetables, healthy protein, healthy grains, and it also promotes socialization and helping these students, you know, rather than grabbing a granola bar really quick between classes, come take a few minutes, get a good, healthy, well-balanced meal, and, you know, share some time with other people in conversation. So this program has been fantastic, and about 120 students had been coming, you know, weekly for this free meal. And then certainly once the pandemic hit and we moved to virtual instruction, you know, Farm to Fork was no more. And so what we're trying to understand now, we actually have a research project where we're surveying those individuals, those students who'd been using the Farm to Fork program, had come for a meal, and we're asking them survey questions about how the pandemic has impacted them from a financial standpoint, but also from a health and wellness standpoint, both physical health as well as their mental health as well. And so we've started to get some of that data in, and we anticipate more over the next several weeks as well. All right, so the last point, you know, when it comes to dietetics and nutrition is, what is the role of nutrition and diet in COVID-19? And this is one of those where there's a lot of headlines that have made their way around about specific nutrients, specific types of diets. What can you do to, you know, right, what can I do to prevent, you know, getting COVID-19? Well, the reality is COVID-19 is a viral respiratory illness. So does eating massive quantities of vitamin D mean I'm not going to get COVID-19? Probably not. But what we do probably know is that building up your immune system, trying to reduce inflammation in your body, being at a healthy body weight, and just trying to be as overall as healthy as possible could be beneficial if you were to be exposed to the COVID-19 virus, and to minimize your risk of serious side effects from the COVID-19. There has been some research that's come out about obesity being a risk factor for hospitalization with COVID-19. And it does appear that those individuals, particularly who have excess body fat, so when we talk about obesity, we're really talking about body composition. How much fat mass versus muscle mass do you have? So if you have more fat mass, that can promote a pro-inflammatory environment, which can lead to more serious symptoms that could be associated with the COVID-19. So we still have a lot to learn when it comes to diet and COVID-19, but there are certainly some relationships to explore. And, you know, if people wanted to put any, you know, specific things you want us to talk about in the chat box, I'm happy to go through more of those details. But with that, I'm going to throw it back to Steve and look forward to Jason's conversation about the hospitality industry.
Well, Tammy, thank you very much for your insights on that. And I meant to ask you this at the beginning. And Tammy mentioned if any of you guys have questions, put them in the chat room. Trey can answer, sort of monitoring that for us, and we'll try to get to those and have a little bit of time at the end. But Tammy, the other day I thought it was a typo or a new version of the virus when I saw somebody talk about the COVID-15.
There we go. So it was not a typo. There are certainly, we've probably all heard of the freshman 15. So the premise that when you go away to college that you might gain 15 pounds, which quite honestly, the research doesn't support 15 pounds, maybe a few pounds, most of it related to you're just getting a little older and your metabolism slowing down. But yeah, there's also been some talk about the COVID-15 and the fact because of all that baking, and depending on a person's situation, many people, it's been difficult to get enough physical activity. You know, I think of people in New York City and their apartments. I can't imagine not being able to leave my apartment to get some physical activity. So there's no research on it, but perhaps for some people they've gained a little weight, perhaps they've lost a little weight.
That's probably for folks like me who thought there was nothing whatsoever wrong with the cake today.
There you go.
Okay, well, Tammy, thank you very much for your insights, and let's move on. We realize that the food service and restaurant trade has been severely affected by this. Jason Swanson is an associate professor at UK in retailing and tourism. He teaches classes in tourism planning. In fact, some of you may have seen Jason and some of his students on KET, probably a little over a year ago, sometime last year, with a KET series called Transformative Travels, Exploring Kentucky, where he took some students out into Western Kentucky for a tour, and that became a KET series. And I understand there's going to be another one showing up this year later from some students that went to London, England, not Kentucky. So, so Jason, we're glad to have you on, and if you'd like to share some insights and outlooks for this link of the food chain.
Sure, thanks for having me. I am not one of those award winners, I should say. I have not won a Great Teacher Award, but I know people who have, and that's why I'm here. So thanks, Tammy and Steve, for inviting me, and thanks for hosting this. I'm going to share my screen with you. We're going to talk about food away from home, specifically that's restaurants, and how restaurants have been impacted in terms of the industry and also the consumer experience. But I want us to take another poll. So if Trey could launch that, now's the time. And the poll is asking you, how has your behavior changed in terms of dining out at restaurants? So restaurants were closed. We couldn't enjoy restaurants like we normally would have. So I want to get a sense of how long it will be until you're going to be eating in restaurants like you were before COVID-19. So go ahead and answer that question, those questions, and we'll get back to that in a few slides, and hopefully we'll be able to spend some time with those results when we get there. All right. So first off, the impact on the industry is, in terms of demand, we all know that restaurants took a big hit, but let's just get a couple snapshots of what that looked like. So this is data from May 31. So the number of people who were dining in restaurants on May 31, 2020, compared to the same day, 2019, and this is global, so worldwide, is down 83% on that day. So that's just one illustration of how demand has been impacted in restaurants. Let's look at it a different way also. I'm going to make that chart a little bigger so you can see it. And this is an average daily revenue year over year. So it's comparing 2020 to 2019. And again, those numbers, there's a steep decline after restaurants started closing. And just to give you a sense of what we're looking at, this is data for Kentucky by week, and it's covering the time period from mid-February up until just last week. So before we got really serious about the pandemic, restaurants were kind of doing how they were last year. I'm going to take a picture of this in case we lose it again. So pardon my interruption there. I'll look at that when we get to it. So restaurants started closing about mid-March and declined pretty quickly. So imagine yourself in mid-March as a restaurant operator, and you see that your business is down more than 70% from where it was last year. And one thing you might ask yourself is, how long is this going to last? We have an idea of that now. It lasted about 2 months, where demand, or revenue in this case, was down about 70% throughout the times before restaurants started opening here in Kentucky. So they have started opening up again. And we can see, even though maybe there's a plateau, restaurants are not anywhere near where they were last year, and they're still less than 50% of the revenue. So that's a big hit. And hopefully you can get a sense of what that looks like for the restaurant operators. All right, so let's talk a little bit about what that means in terms of supply. So there was a survey done, self-reported survey, asking restaurant operators, do you expect your business to last for the next 3 months? And 14% said we've either already closed or we will close within the next 3 months. So only 86% of restaurants are expected to survive. We know that there's limited capacity in most states. That ranges from 33 to 50%. It's currently 33 in Kentucky. That's going to go up to 50%, I heard yesterday, in a couple of weeks. But that still limits the supply that's out there. So if we do the math there, we've got about 28% to maybe 43% of supply, what the current supply of restaurant seats versus what it was before the pandemic, considering all the closures and then the policies that have been in place. So there's been big impacts on demand, but also big impacts on supply. And I would refer to my economist colleagues on the panel if they want to interpret what that means in terms of prices, but there's a lot of chaos right now in the industry. And the big question is, how long will that last? When will we start to return to normal? Another part of the disruption, and Tammy touched on this, is in terms of employment. The food service employees made up the bulk of those jobs that were lost in the US during the month of March. So out of all the jobs lost, 60% of them came from restaurants. And up to this point, about between 5 and 7 million hospitality service workers are now unemployed in the US. So there's an individual impact on the service side as well. Restaurants are starting to reopen, but some of those operators are having difficulty getting people to return to work because of the benefits they're getting through unemployment are actually better than what they would make if they were to go back to their job. And that's another big economics discussion that we could have on the situation of the labor market in hospitality and tourism. So what are some of those concerns of
Jack, it appears that we have frozen screen.
I think Jason's screen is frozen, but everybody else should be up now.
Okay. I'm an economist, not an IT guy, so that's pretty obvious right now. Although,
There we go. I think he may jump back on.
okay, let's give Jason a second to try to jump back on. Meanwhile,
Steve, do you want me
all
to
is-
handle one of the questions that's on here while we're waiting for Jason?
sure, that would be great. While we're waiting for Jason, Tammy, you
Yeah.
had one of the
So I
questions?
see
or
a couple
Craig?
of questions have been coming in about specific nutrients and how they relate to COVID-19. And so one of them is about vitamin C, and then I know vitamin D has come up. And really, I think it's just about food as medicine. So there's a lot of research about a vaccine, which is obviously necessary, and it's different than food. And so these types of studies, while there's anecdotal evidence out there, those types of studies are going to take several months and years to actually gather some good quality data. So to answer those questions, the results seem promising, but should you go out and start taking massive doses of vitamin C and vitamin D? The answer to that is 2 thumbs down, right? What we want to do is try to eat healthy foods that contain vitamin C, contain vitamin D. If possible, get out and to get some natural vitamin D from the sunlight. So at this point, we shouldn't be recommending that people take high doses of any of these vitamins. And if you are going to do that, it'd be really important to do that under the care of a healthcare provider, because some of them can actually have negative effects on your health that you wouldn't have even thought about. So just being really careful about those. And at the end of the day, we do know vitamin C builds up your immune system. So yes, eat more spinach and kale and all those oranges and such, but maybe not go to the vitamin C supplement right now.
Okay. And Trey, you're monitoring the chat room. We still don't have Jason back. Hope we get him back here in just a second, but do you have another question there you might like to put out? And Jason's coming back.
Hey, everybody. All right, where was I now? All right. Did I miss anything?
Tammy did a wonderful job of answering a question about
All right, great.
vitamin C and vitamin D. so yeah, we were filling in space.
All right. I
Folks,
think
this is live. This is live webinar, which means that if something goes wrong, we don't stop.
Yeah. All right, so I'm just going to go faster. Consumer attitudes. This gets back to the question I asked you. So I want to see what your responses were to the poll that was based on this question. And I don't know if that can be shown, but I'll say that most people are saying in this audience that it's going to be more than 6 months from now until your behavior in terms of eating in restaurants returns to what it was before COVID-19. And I think that kind of aligns with what we see there. More in this chart, more than 50% are saying it's going to be 3 months or more, or even will never return. So that's an important aspect of it. So the experience is kind of moving from a high touch experience to a low touch. In restaurants, people greet you, they seat you, they bring you food, they share that experience with you in terms of the servers. We're not seeing that as much anymore. There's less contact, there's less interaction with the servers. And my question is, how will that impact the experience that diners have when it comes to eating in restaurants? Social distance is another thing that's important in restaurants. What that means for restaurants is the space between each table. It's 6 feet right now, is a lot of the regulations, but 27% are saying they want to see more than 6 feet and even up to 15 feet in order to feel comfortable. So what does that look like? How can operators get creative with that? Here's one way. A bar in Florida has repurposed some bumper boats and are trying to keep people socially distant like that. A place in Germany is putting pool noodles on their head. Sorry, I haven't shared my screen again, like he said. So that's my bumper boat picture. Hopefully you can see that. The pool noodle, that's maybe more fun than functional. I'm not sure how well that works. That we've seen in Amsterdam, kind of a way to, a romantic solution probably to dining with a companion, less romantic. I'm not sure how exciting that would be to have a meal in a situation like that. We'll probably see more of this in urban environments around the world, in larger cities where they just don't have the space to distance as much. And skip that. What we'll normally see, or probably see more typically, is this servers wearing masks and gloves and the arrows on the floor telling everybody which way to walk, and customers probably having to wear masks when they get up and go to the restrooms and that sort of thing. So a lot of different ways that our experience is being impacted. One of the questions that I think consumers will have, and it gets back to what Tammy was talking about, and actually the highest score in Tammy's poll was about, or the result there was, people have cooked more at home. Will that continue to be a better option than going to restaurants? That's one thing that consumers have to figure out. And also, we're going to want to know what restaurants are doing to protect us if there's still the threat of spread from coronavirus. What are they doing to alleviate that and make us feel more comfortable? And will that change in experience affect our willingness to pay higher prices? So with that, mine's done. Thanks for your patience. My technology challenges, and I'll turn that back over to Steve.
Okay, well, Jason, thanks a lot, and certainly, and appreciate all of you who participated in the polls for Tammy and Jason as well. I think that's something that makes this more interactive. I discovered as a teacher trying to finish up spring semester using technologies that I was not familiar with, that if I could engage students in the chat room, or I could engage students in work groups or polling, then it made it a much richer experience. So I really appreciate all of you who came in on the chat room. And real quickly, it looks like we've got probably 7 minutes or so here. Trey, do you have, you've been looking at the questions for us. Do you have a good question or two? And then I may introduce a speaker here or a guest in a moment.
That's right. Sure. So we have a question here from our colleague, Larry Grabo, just back from Belgium, not seeing a disruption in food supplies there, a very different configuration of food production, processing, and delivery. Are there lessons we can learn as producers and consumers from such European, decentralized, less vertical food production and distribution systems?
Yes, Trey and Steve, I'll jump in on that one. Obviously, the model in Europe probably relates back, Steve, to what your discussion on was shaped by World War II. Sort of the production model as well as the processing model is different. In this country, we talk a lot about our cheap food supply or efficient food supply. We have the top 4 meat packers out there control about 80% of the market. And we as consumers have benefited from the standpoint of cheap food, lower food prices. It's provided technology to our producers out there, the economies of scale, the research and development. So there's been some positives, but when two negatives. When you have 80% of the market being controlled by 4 firms, if you have a major pandemic disruption in that supply, then that's going to really back the system, which we assume had not, occurred in other countries. The other thing, from a producer standpoint, there's a lot of discussion right now about concentration. Competition, we all know, is good. So it's this trade-off of efficiency versus concentration. And I think at the end of the day, I think the cost of doing business, whether you're a restaurant or if you're a processor, it's going to go up. And what I worry, Steve, as an economist, what does that do to competition of some of these small regional independent suppliers out there? Can they afford the higher cost, which, the larger, more concentrated industries are able to pass that cost on to consumers? So again, it's a different model in Europe. Food prices are higher, but yet maybe they've alleviated some of the, some of the challenges we've had that we've learned from COVID-19.
And Will, and you're aware of this and can jump in as well. I'm sure many of our folks, viewers in the ag community, are familiar with this, but local meat processing the demand for that has just gone through the roof. There's not a meat processor in Kentucky that is not booked solid through the end of the year and booking into next year. And there's been some efforts institutionally to try to bolster that industry and get some more throughput through that. So that demand has certainly increased a lot, Will.
Certainly.
Okay.
I think that might translate to a larger trend in localism that we'll see from this particular. I'm speaking from a travel and tourism perspective. One of the impacts on travel is going to be more local travel instead of getting on an airplane or doing a longer vacation. So there's going to be more interest in what is happening at the local level, even more so than before. So what you're saying, Steve, could align with that.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I think what we see is a kind of a dual model out there. We're still going to have the 9 billion people that's really discussed a lot to feed in the world market. And again, we are scaling up some of this local food production, but I think it's going to take both some of the scale economies that we've got from some of our large agribusiness entities, as well as this continued movement towards local food. I don't see it slowing down, providing a lot of opportunities for our producers out there. And Tammy, arguably a better quality product, and certainly keeping those dollars in the local rural communities is very important.
Okay, well, thanks. And I'm sure we have some other questions. And what I'm going to do right now is call a little bit of an audible. We're running up against 5 o'clock. I would like to introduce very quickly, we're aware that one of our participants is Dr. Brady Deaton, sort of a mentor and colleague to many of us in the agricultural economics world and the food world, and someone who has given a good bit of thought to this. So Brady, it looks like maybe we have you listed as a panelist now. If you'd like to make a quick observation. And then after Brady, we will hang around. The panelists will hang around. Do not feel compelled to stay on the call. We wanted this to run from 4 to 5 o'clock. But if you'd like to stay around and we can field another question or two, we will certainly do that. One real quickly that I saw come in was to repeat that quote that I used at the beginning from Eric Severide. And that is that few men are more than 9 meals away from crime or suicide. So Brady, that's a bit of a downer statement, but if you'd like to chime in, we'd love to hear an observation from you.
Well, Steve, thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Well, I appreciate very much the opportunity to participate, and I see a few familiar faces here. Marcy Hicks made sure that I was aware of this webinar, and I want to applaud every one of you for being just a wonderful speakers and informed professionals about a topic that's got all of us very much on the edge of our seat. And I gained a great deal from each one of your presentations. And I should add that I'm a very proud graduate of the agricultural economics department there at Kentucky, and have gone on and tried to hold it high in everything that I have done. I particularly was intrigued by a number of you, and I won't go on because I know this is other people's program here, but I have been doing some writing and thinking about the COVID-19 issue, and in fact, on Friday of this week, I'm going to be engaged in an interview with Heifer International. Pierre Ferrari we're going to be discussing it because of some recent writing I was doing with my son, who also has Kentucky roots and is now up at Guelph in Canada. But I've been working with the COVID-19 from just thinking about it conceptually and looking particularly worldwide at many of the issues that we are facing because of the role I'm now playing with our USAID agency on BIFAD. I serve on the Board for International Food and Agricultural Development. And this COVID-19 we have pushed forward as a major topic of discussion, and particularly to look at the interface of the regional markets that was brought up just a moment ago. And then Tammy talked about the nutritional aspects that are a real great concern when we look at the fact that this COVID-19 loss of income and inability to access food when needed may affect the most vulnerable populations, the mothers and the infant children, and perhaps contributing to stunting in ways that we have not seen in the past. So after about 3 decades of tremendous progress, we now run the risk of going backwards in a way that we have not for a very long time. And we're pushing very much, trying to look at every one of your ideas and to find ways of making our attack on COVID-19 a step toward building more resilience and strength in the local economies, not only in the United States and Canada, but also in Africa, Asia, and other parts of the world, so that we end up using this as an opportunity to take a step forward and come out better with stronger supply chains. I think it's remarkable, Will has emphasized this, how strong the supply chains are now that are serving us. But this is a compound, surprising set of events that have hit us, and we've got to find innovative ways to resolve this that will leave us stronger than we were before. So with that, let me just say thank you. I've gained a lot from it. You may hear yourselves quoted as I go down the line, and I'm very happy to do that. And I appreciate my roots at Kentucky. So Jack, good to see you also on the screen here. And to Steve, I congratulate all of you on just a fabulous program. Thanks so much.
Well, Brady, thanks very much for joining us, and really appreciate your work in the ag and food world over the years, and all the things that you've done to promote this industry. So,
thank you so much.
okay.
You on for a moment here. I'll let you go then. Thanks again.
Okay. Thanks, Brady. Trey, I mean, we're past 5 o'clock, but if folks are still hanging on and want to entertain another question or two, I think we can do that. We can run into overtime here on a tied game, right, Will?
That's right.
And there's I think a really compelling question from Steve Rogenkamp here that is sort of asking about getting at how the COVID-19 situation with food and our food production system has maybe revealed to us in new ways some of the social justice problems with our food supply system or food chain. And so the question was just sort of tossed out to anyone on the panel just to reflect on that, and maybe if there are any particular ideas or insights about what this this moment has revealed about some of the issues.
Now, I can take that from a social justice standpoint. You know, what we know is that there were many individuals who were already very vulnerable and susceptible to food insecurity, poverty, and related issues. And so what COVID-19 pandemic has done is really magnified that. And so those people who are already vulnerable are now going to have an even higher level of vulnerability, and unnecessary that we figure out how to support and ensure that, again, people have access to what they need to stay healthy in a wide variety of ways. So point well taken. And I think, you know, I don't know if you all want to approach it from, you know, a producer type standpoint, but I know from where I sit, yes, we need to address this because it's going to get worse before it gets better.
I think one thing that's going to be a challenge for helping it to get better is a lot of the people who have been laid off within the hospitality industry are part of the vulnerable population as well. So that adds to the challenge.
Maybe not
Go ahead, Will.
necessarily a social injustice issue, but it's certainly a social issue that a lot of people employed at the farm level, as well as all the way through the food chain, are foreign descent, migrant workers, certainly in the farm sector.
Mm-hmm.
And I think they're very vulnerable, not only from a processing standpoint, the tight quarters that they work in, but also the housing and transportation issues of getting those people to and from work and where they live kind of probably lends itself to increased risk with COVID. What I see coming on, not only in ag, but throughout the food chain, is probably more automation. We struggled, Steve, in agriculture from a cost perspective to put in automation, but I think that's what's going to happen. And as a result, again, I think it's going to increase the cost we all have to pay for food to kind of reduce the risk of laborers out there.
Mm-hmm. And I think sort of in regards to this question as well, Will, is that we tend to use a lot of averages in terms of average amount of income spent on food, and income inequality masks that a great deal. I mean, folks who make less spend a much higher percentage of their income on food and are much more sensitive to changes in food supply and food prices. So, Tammy, yes, there are vulnerable populations out there, and I think it's important to be aware of that and just not lose that in the averages of the discussion about a safe, healthy, and cheap food supply, because it depends a bit on where you live and who you are and how much you make. So I think there's an awareness of that. So, okay, good, very good question. We're about 5 minutes after. We've been running a little long on this, but Trey, did you see one other real quick question that you had a compelling question there?
Yeah, we can do, this question may not take too long to answer. So this is from Ed Reeves. This is, we've heard about meat processing plants and restaurants being environments for the spread of the COVID-19 infection. Are there other kinds of businesses in the food supply chain which have been affected as much as these?
Will can weigh in here in a second as well, but certainly we have seen some reports of harvesting crews or crews that are using, workers that are cohabited in bunkhouse type settings. In Eastern Tennessee, a couple of, maybe last week, Will, Strawberry Operation had 29, 39, I don't remember, it was somewhere around 25 to 30 workers that tested positive for COVID. So any place I think that puts workers in proximity, that's going to be an issue.
I really don't have anything to add to that. There was more news stories today as these work crews, especially get ready for harvest, that it's probably going to escalate. I know our labor associations are working a lot with our producers out there on social distancing, hand washing stations, and trying to do a lot of things recommended by CDC to minimize the risk. But it is a very concerning situation because producers can't afford a 14-day quarantine with workers out there.
Right. Well, Jack, I'm going to apologize. I should have, before we hit the 5 o'clock mark, have let you come in on saying something about next week's presentation, but it looks like we still have 75 or so participants still on. So if you would like to come back in and tell us what we're going to see next week.
Absolutely. Change that. Thanks, Steve. Appreciate it. And I want to thank you and Will and Tammy and Jason and Trey and everybody who participated as panelists, and certainly to Dr. Deaton for coming on and joining us. We appreciated that. Certainly want to thank all the participants, all the attendees who hung with us today. I do want to briefly introduce Dr. Martha Riddell from the College of Public Health, who is a 2020 Great Teacher Award recipient. And she will be hosting and moderating next week's panel, which will be next Wednesday, June 17th. At the same time, 4 o'clock. The topic will be public health in the time of COVID-19. So Dr. Riddell, if you're on, feel free to give a quick promo for next week's session. I don't know if she was able to join us. Let me see. Dr. Riddell, are you there?
I am now. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Absolutely.
Okay. Great. Thank you, Jack.
I may not have pushed the right button.
Okay. Thank you all for great presentations today. Those are very, very informative. Next week, as Jack said, we continue with the series from my home college, the College of Public Health. And with us will be Kathleen Winter. Kathleen is an infectious disease epidemiologist, so she's going to be talking about control and prevention, or basically what do we know now about COVID-19. Dr. Teresa Waters, who's head of our Department of Health Management and Policy, will speak about her work in modeling COVID-19, or how we help healthcare organizations prepare for the future. Keith Knapp is also in health management and policy, and he's going to talk about really one of our most vulnerable populations, that being long-term care, an area that he knows extremely well. And we'll wrap up with our dean, Dr. Donna Arnett, who's going to speak about population level disparities. So just different examples of how our faculty in public health is working in the real world with real-time problems. And we hope you can join us then. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Riddell. And with that, we will conclude today's Great Teachers on Great Challenges webinar. Again, thank you to all of our panelists and participants and attendees, and want to thank everybody for staying with us, and hope you will join us next week. Thank you very much. Have a great day.